Huge announcement, the United States are sending the Fantastic Four to save Ukraine. No, not those ones. I meant the 4 MQ-1C Grey Eagle that they plan to send to Ukraine. Sending 4 of them will definitely change the course of the war. Next, Arestovich, the advisor of the president of Ukraine, said that Ukrainians trapped Russian troops in Severodonetsk by pretending to surrender the city. Now the Russian command is in shock. In all honesty, if anyone got trapped, it's the Ukrainians. Whoops! I'm not allowed to say that, because I forgot to tell you guys. As a friendly advice, don't you dare bring up problems related to the Ukrainian side, even if you mean well, because some people will go nuts, like salty people. You'll immediately be called pro-Russian, an orc. No, seriously, at least call me an urukai, like the buff orcs. Disclaimer, if the facts are too much for you to handle, just go watch some fantasy stuff like Star Wars. The Disney version, of course. Capiche? Entendido? Compris? Verstanden? Verhamt? Anyway, what the hell is actually going on at Severodonetsk? Are Ukrainians really clapping some Russian cheeks for breakfast? That's what you'll discover in a second. Hi and welcome to History Legends. Here the latest news about the Russo-Ukrainian war. Here we cut the BS and talk about what the media doesn't tell you. As always, information changes by the hour, so if you have any new info, just comment it below. If you're new to this channel, make sure to check out my Ukraine playlist so you don't miss anything I've said in the past. And as you know, some of my latest Ukraine videos, including the past one, have been targeted with limited or no ads. So make sure to check out my Patreon or my PayPal to keep the show running. Ukrainian Army report. As we speak, Ukrainians are firmly holding onto the Severodonetsk River, as well as at Severodonetsk, and they sort of stalled the Russian progression at Popasna. They even massively expanded the bridgehead near Hotemlia as part of the Kharkiv offensive, and they just launched a new counterattack in Kherson. But according to the latest news, the Kherson bridgehead was once again beaten back, so yeah. The Battle of Severodonetsk explained. Overall, the situation is very confusing, because we get so many conflicting reports. We have to step back a few days to understand what actually happened. It all started when Russian armed forces claimed control over 70 to 80% of the city, essentially all residential areas, and the FU, the Armed Forces of Ukraine, held on to the Azot chemical plant, similar to Azovstal but smaller. And there were allegedly 800 Ukrainians defending this factory. Overall, the problem is not Severodonetsk itself, but all the towns and villages around it, the suburbs. It was reported that Ukrainians had about 4,000 men spread out all over this bank. And ultimately, their goal was to link up with their buddies at Lysychansk, 6,000 men, which tactically speaking were located on a much better position on a high ground across the river. Thing is, the Ukrainian General Staff asked for this withdrawal for weeks, but it was always denied. Now initially the Russians tried to break through from the suburbs but were not successful. And all of a sudden they broke through in the urban area of Severodonetsk. I don't know exactly what they do, but they became pretty good at urban warfare like we've seen at Liman, Popasna, and of course Mariupol. Essentially, the Russian army has two major problems. Number one, communications to coordinate complex maneuvers. And number two, a rigid hierarchy which doesn't provide local commanders enough flexibility to adjust to the real-time situation. To compensate for these weaknesses, the Russians simply attack urban areas head-on, using brute force and clear one sector after another after intense artillery barrage, as this is a typical set-piece battle. The problem for us is that this battle of attrition works in their favor. And you have to understand that the Azot factory is very important because it represents some sort of fortress within the city, but at the same time the bridge leading up to it is destroyed and only allows limited passage through it. So the Russian target was not necessarily the Azot factory, but if they pushed further south towards Lisna Dasha and Sirotine. Overall, the important position for Ukraine to hold at all costs was this rectangle here. Because if the Russians pushed through and actually reached the Severodonetsk River, which could then allow them to storm the last standing bridge, and in turn the Ukrainians would have no other choice but to blow it up. They would segment, chunk up the defenders into smaller, weaker pockets. The guys at Azot would be surrounded, these guys surrounded, and these guys as well. Just like what they did at Mariupol. And ultimately, everyone knows what this means. surrender. Can we at least agree that this is a worthy opponent? And as you can imagine, the Ukrainians faced a difficult, critical situation. But what they did was quite smart, remarkable. Initially, the goal was to do a fighting retreat from Severodonetsk towards Lysychansk across the river, aka the safe zone. Thing is, if it was done too fast, it could lead to a chain reaction of panic. Imagine you're fighting and all of a sudden you see all your buddies drive off and you see that they're scared. What do? Most likely you'll also run. And of all this would have caused a lot of casualties. But instead they traded troops. Individual units of the armed forces of Ukraine were withdrawing in small groups towards Lysychansk. At the same time, well-trained foreign volunteers were sent to Severodonetsk. This shows greater tactical skills from the AFU compared to the static defense previously seen in the war. In my opinion, this task force of foreign units counterattack from this direction. In the overall direction of Metalkino, the objective was to push as far as possible to secure this corridor and prevent the encirclement of Ukrainian forces. Now again, there are conflicting reports, but I'll tell you one version of the story. Apparently, this task force was launched by Mariana Bezuglaya, supported by a strong contingent of foreign fighters. Their intervention managed to keep the defenses of Severodonetsk from disintegrating. Put simply, they saved thousands of Ukrainian soldiers. In fact, it turned out that these Russian claims of controlling 70–80% of the city were exaggerated. And the irony is that this has been followed by the Ukrainians claiming that they have now recaptured half the city. A half that they pretty much already controlled. The changes in overall control were relatively small. The Ukraine counterattack did force Russian and LPR forces out of the 78th and 82nd micro districts and from most of Metalkine. It seems that the Russians retreated, regrouped, and then counterattacked to reclaim the ground they had just lost. In other words, this Ukrainian counteroffensive was more like an attempt to reinforce their remaining positions in Severodonetsk. Anyway, the important thing is that the Ukrainians managed to push the Russians away from Sirotine and Lysychansk. However, even though the front line has not changed enormously, the fighting has allegedly increased in intensity. As for losses, I can't say much. According to the Russians, the foreign fighters suffered heavy losses, but nobody knows. It might just be the Russians being very salty. Although this information is sort of supported by Canadian journalist Neil Hauer, who spoke with one foreign volunteer who is now at Severodonetsk. He said that his unit is already being pulled out after heavy losses, 3 killed and 6 wounded out of only 24 people, within only 24 hours. And in the end, many claimed that the objective of this counterattack was not to reclaim the city of Severodonetsk, especially since it extends the front line even more, but rather to control the Russian advance and coordinate a later withdrawal. In the end, this is the true situation on the ground at Severodonetsk. Russians are in control of 70% of the city, whereas Ukrainians only hold the factory. There's also battles in the surrounding villages, but since apparently the Russians have a 7-to-1 advantage and a lot of readily available reserves, that means that Metalkine is certainly going to fall soon as well. The governor of Luhansk even said the situation in Severodonetsk worsened for us. We continue to control the industrial area. So who actually got trapped? Ukrainians only have a solid hold on the Azot factory. They suffered heavy losses in units considered to be elite, and now have several pockets of Ukrainian forces that might have a hard time withdrawing. Questions: why was a 34-year-old member of the Ukrainian parliament in charge of this task force? And why was she supported by a contingent of foreign fighters? And like the well-respected Austrian Colonel Oberst Markus Reisner said, it is not known whether there is a hold order telling the Ukrainians to stay in the pocket. However, there are already some videos showing Ukrainian soldiers going back, either on orders or on their own. However, this can set off a chain reaction. If this is true, this could explain why they sent foreign fighters. This task force was also composed of elite Ukrainian Special Operations Forces supported by the last combat-ready units from the Kramatorsk garrison. Perhaps all the others refused to go. Perhaps they considered more loyal, since maybe they're less likely to surrender to the Russians. Again, that's all speculation. Could also be that there's actual friction between the local military commanders and the political leadership. Perhaps why they brought troops from completely different districts. Who knows? Here's another question. How long can Ukrainians expect to hold on to Severodonetsk? As we already talked about in the previous video, holding Severodonetsk and Lysychansk is pointless from a military perspective. When we know that their flanks and rear are increasingly pressured, we have to look at the Battle of Severodonetsk as an ensemble. The lifeline of the urban area of Lysychansk and Severodonetsk is the T-1302 highway. Ukrainians are fighting tooth and nail for its control, and the Russians too. They just lost another general in this area. Even though the Russians don't have a direct control on this highway, they have a fire control on it. That means that the artillery can basically bombard anything going through it. And that means that a lot less Ukrainian drivers are willing to drive through this highway to reach Lysychansk because it's so dangerous. And apparently there's a lack of supply trucks. Less trucks equals less supplies. And with little supplies, how long can we expect this Ukraine grouping to hold? And now Ukrainians establish a secondary line going through Seversk. It makes logistics difficult. Ukrainians also must be on edge. They know that Russian troops could cross the Severodonetsk river in an attempt to capture Seversk, which will cut the last road leading to Lysychansk and thus complete the encirclement. In my opinion, a sound maneuver would have been to withdraw from Luhansk before the Popasna breakthrough and establish a line of defense along the Donetsk administration line. The left flank would be covered by the Severodonetsk river and the right flank by all the bastions of the contact line. And overall, it would shorten the front line, which could give a lot of Ukrainian units some much needed rest. However, this 20 km by 20 km square represents Ukraine's last grip on the separatist region of Luhansk. If the Russians finalize the capture of all of Luhansk, it will be an important political victory for Putin that could even galvanize his troops. All this situation can be explained by President Zelensky himself. He said that if you retreat to better positions, then it will be very costly in terms of losses to regain that ground. An estimated 5 times more losses. But it also means that the Russians are in full control of the situation. Media versus reality. I think that this entire story about Severodonetsk and all the Hollywood around it is another PR stunt. However, according to official reports, the war is going well despite all the problems. But don't you dare to bring them up. Now, in my opinion, by pushing this narrative that everything is well,
it's going relatively well for the Ukrainians.
You just put yourself in a corner where you can't retreat. And if they do, the Ukrainian government will lose face. You'll show everyone that it was all BS and that it's not actually going so well. And what could happen next? Panic. Like Black Friday sales in the United States. And this is more or less the theory of Oblast Marcos Razdan. What now? From an operational level, it seems that the Russians have once again shifted their Schwerpunkt to another location. You know me, I always think of the worst case scenario, but in a way I fear that it's the Ukrainians that got trapped or baited, whether on purpose or not. Just like the Romans at Cannes, Ukrainians are sending more and more forces into that salient, at the complete end of that salient. What do you think that the Carthaginians and Hannibal did next? What do you think the Russians could do next? If they were smart, they could pin down as many Ukrainian forces at Severodonetsk and attack at the complete other end of the salient by launching an attack on Slavyansk and thus completely unbalance Ukrainian reserves. Ukrainians could in fact be able to send reserves to Slavyansk, but from where? Like Oblast Marcos Razdan said, they already sent 7 territorial brigades from western Ukraine to the front line to plug the gaps and allow the Ukrainians to form some Kampfgruppen to counterattack locally Russian advance. But one of these task force was just sent into the Severodonetsk meat grinder. Losing a lot of these men for such a mission could indicate a severe deficit of battle-worthy Ukrainian infantry in the future. Now, I don't know how much it is true, but it has been said that Ukrainians give new recruits 10 days of training before being sent to the front, which leads to a casualty rate of 65%. That's like sending your local football team to compete in the Champions League. Truth be told, the Russians are at arm's length of 4 out of 5 major objectives in Donbass. They're fighting for Severodonetsk. They're closing in on Slavyansk. They also reach the eastern outskirts of Bakhmut, and they're approaching the southern outskirts of Lysychansk. In an honest, truthful question, can Ukrainians effectively defend all these objectives? Or will they have to give one up? I don't know why, but there's something brewing near Popasna. And as you can see, there's a lot of these arrow tips. It represents the furthest extent of one side. But we know it always starts with just the tip until the shaft gets involved. The Russians seem to be bypassing the Ukrainian grouping at Zolote. They just took full control of Kamyshevacha and recently just took control of the villages of Viktorivka and Nirkove north of Popasna. And the Battle of Vrubivka will also be very important. So that's on the west side, but there's also stuff brewing on the east side. The Russians are allegedly fighting for a village called Mirna Dolina, a strategic position located right on the outskirts of Lysychansk, but that also cuts off their northern escape route for the guys at Zolote. If Zolote falls or is abandoned, the situation for the defenders at Lysychansk might become critical. The worst thing would be if the Russians captured the town of Topolivka, essentially a maneuver that would essentially squeeze the Ukrainians on the bank of the Severodonetsk without having to rely on a wet crossing because their latest attempts sort of traumatized the Russians. This is why I don't think the Russians will try to cross over at Seversk, but it depends how many men they're ready to lose for such an important objective. This river crossing is also highly expected by the Ukrainians, although it would technically complete the encirclement of 10 to 15,000 men of the Lysychansk grouping. The reason why I mentioned an attack for the west is because currently the Russians have everything set up for an attack towards Slavyansk. Just look at the density of Ukrainian troops at the eastern end of the salient, but in front of Slavyansk, much less. Now it has to be said that Ukrainians benefit from a central position that allows them to redistribute troops more easily than the Russians. This is essentially how Napoleon won so many battles, because he could defeat his enemies in detail. And this tactic is not new for the Ukrainians because this is what they did at the Battle of Kiev. However, like I mentioned in this video, they'll finalize the capture of this area. This is the backwoods. They need to secure it. They don't want any Ukrainian troops stuck in their back like during the Battle of Kiev. Not gonna happen. The first priority of Russian forces was to clear the entire northern bank of the Severodonetsk. The Battle of Liman acted as the culminating event, and it came to as a shock when the city fell in only 4 days. The media stayed quite silent about it, but slowly but surely the Russians were advancing, as they essentially took over the last Ukrainian positions north of the river, which was completed with the recent capture of the town of Severodonetsk. And the next logical step is an attack towards Slavyansk, from possibly 3 directions. Through this highway from the Izium grouping, which recently captured the villages of Dovenke and Pasika, another push from Severodonetsk, and of course this attack through the river just across Slavyansk at Raihorodok. Again, allegedly, Ukrainians recalled 3,000 cadets from Kharkiv in order to prepare defenses at Slavyansk. Cadets. Anyway, let me know what you thought of my analysis in the comment section below. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And like I said, your support is essential. Make sure to check out my Patreon and my PayPal. The link is in the description.